Hello, boys and girls of the Northeastern Catholic District School Board. It's Mr. Bueller again. I have another story to tell you tonight. Last week I told you the story about the 3 Russian soldiers, and tonight we shall tell you another tale. So that means that I need to get the Book of Wonder, the 1,000-year-old book written by monks long ago and discovered in an old castle. The Book of Wonder with every story known in the world. It's magical. The only story that's not in here is your story. And that's a story that's still being written. And I look forward to reading it one day. So let's move over to the reading area so I can read you a story. So tonight, let's see, I am going to read you an old story that comes from Holland. And this story is called The Widow of Stavoren. Okay. And I should say, my friends, that once again, Princess Zarazarinda from Sweden will be doing the drawing. Thank you, Princess. Once upon a time, there was a wealthy widow in the town of Stavoren. The town was a wealthy port, with many rich people building fine houses on the outskirts of the town. They made their money trading with faraway places like the African coast and India. The widow had taken her deceased husband's business and grown it magnificently, for she was shrewd, determined, and knowledgeable of the ways of man. She had ships trading for her, and she owned the entire harbor of Stavoren. In the town there also lived a sea captain who owned his own sailing ship. He was a very successful trader in his own right. One day he met the widow and fell in love with her. After one successful voyage, the captain returned with a very fine ring from India and proposed marriage to the widow. She accepted the ring, quite impressed with its fine stones and fine workmanship, but she laughed at the captain's suggestion they be married. She carried herself quite aloof and had no interest in a life with the captain. One day it turned out that the captain's ship was wrecked in a storm. He was lucky to escape with his life, but he did. When he returned to Stavoren, he was employed by the widow. He captained one of her ships and continued to be a successful trader. He made the widow a great deal of profit. The widow paid him well, too, and was sure that he was happy, for other rich families in the town wanted to hire the captain so they could benefit from his ability. But the widow never thanked the captain for his great work, and never did she acknowledge the captain as a man who had proposed marriage to her, and least of all desired her friendship. One evening, in preparation for Christmas, the rich of Stavoren gathered for a feast. It was such a fine ball that many of the common folk of the port town came to watch the ball through the windows of the hall. It is also possible that the townspeople were looking for leavings from the feast, for the fact of the matter was that drought had recently begun to threaten them with famine. During the feast, the widow and many of the rich women gathered, showing each other their finest treasures. They had many fine things, including jewelry and fine dresses and gowns. Discussion began to turn to who had the finest treasure, and there was little agreement. Finally, they came up with a contest. In the following year, at the next Christmas feast, they would gather to see who had found the most priceless and valuable piece of jewelry, or piece of art, or other such treasure. The next day, the widow called for the captain. She explained about the contest and gave him her finest ship with great amounts of gold and silver aboard. His mission was to find the priceless thing for her whatever it may end up being. So she would win the contest. The captain was dismayed at what he saw. With all this wealth, he suggested, why shouldn't she instead share with the common folk? People were growing desperately poor with the emerging famine. Sharing her wealth with them would please God immensely. The widow's face grew red with rage. How dare you interfere? She asked. You have been given a mission. I expect you to carry it out. Full of sadness, the captain bowed his way out of her waiting room and set sail in search of something luxurious and priceless. At his next port of call, however, he met another sea captain from Stavoren. The famine in our town is growing worse, said this sailor. There was worry on his face. The captain of the widow's finest ship set his jaw. What is the most priceless thing in the world? Why, surely at this time of trouble, the most priceless treasure would be a ship full of grain, enough grain to feed Stavoren for a year. So the captain set sail for Lisbon, and once there purchased a ship full of clean, golden grain. The widow is bound to be excited to see this, he thought, and her esteem in the town will know no bounds. And so he returned to his home port 6 months ahead of schedule. When the widow saw her ship crest the horizon, with her emblems fluttering in the wind, she got in her gilded carriage and quickly went to the harbor. When she greeted the captain, she insisted he show her the priceless gift he had brought for her. So he showed her the cargo of precious golden grain, and the leftover gold and silver which she could continue using as she saw fit. The widow was greatly upset. How dare you interfere? She shouted. The captain explained the needs of Stavoren and the place of honor and privilege that awaited her if she could share this grain with the people who were hungry. God will surely smile upon this deed, the captain added, and the widow grew very angry. What side did you load this ship from? She asked. The left side, the captain answered. Fine, the widow retorted. In that case, dump the cargo over the right side. By now, the people of the town had come to see for themselves what was happening. They were hungry and had heard about the cargo of golden grain the captain had brought for them. Over the protestations of the captain and the moans of the people, the widow insisted her sailors throw the wheat, all the wheat, overboard into the water, and so they did. A time may well come, said the captain, when you will feel the pangs of hunger yourself. When that time comes, you will better understand how foolish you have been today. The widow laughed. I have 12 ships trading for me at sea, she said, and I own 3 large banks. She took off her beautiful ring from India that the captain had proposed marriage with. She threw the ring into the sea. There is a better chance of me seeing this ring again than that I should ever be hungry in this lifetime, and she spun on her heel and left the harbor. The people and the captain were very dismayed. The next day at market, the widow's chef bought a fish, brought it home, and prepared it for a meal. Inside the fish was the widow's ring. He ran to her with the ring. The widow grew pale and fearful. Over the next few months, she received report after report about her 12 sailing ships. Some were sunk by weather, one caught fire and was destroyed, and still others were taken by pirates. So she went to her banks, but because of the growing famine, they had no more money to give her. But she still had her harbor, and against the harbor she took out a loan for another ship. But the captain she hired for this new ship was a thief, and he sailed away with her new ship and her borrowed money, and was never seen again. She wanted now to sell her harbor to pay for the failed loan, but a storm blew up, churning the sea ferociously, and when the storm was over, a large sandbar blocked the now worthless harbor. The townspeople began to fish in the hopes of surviving the famine, and the widow was forced to flee the town in search of work somewhere else. No one in the town would hire her or help her, for they remembered what she had done with the golden grain. In fact, they were reminded of her wasteful act, For on the sandbar grew tall stalks of grass. People assumed this grass grew from the seeds that she had thrown overboard, but there was no grain on this grass to eat, so it was worthless to everyone. The captain, meanwhile, had found a new ship to take charge of, and he began to amass a new fortune. Eventually, he bought a beautiful farm and retired there. Every autumn, he helped his workers with the harvest, and he was very grateful. Sometimes, as he walked through his fields in front of the setting sun, he wondered about the widow. He felt like returning to Stavoren to see about her well-being, but in the end, he knew she had to suffer through her circumstances alone. The widow, meanwhile, had been traveling town to town and farm to farm, looking for work as a maid or as a farmhand. Work was hard to find, and many days she survived without food to eat. The only thing of value she still had was the captain's ring, and while she could have sold it and remained fed for a year, she retained the ring. It was precious to her, and reminded her of the captain's wisdom and of his warning to her. One autumn, as the captain looked over the fields they had harvested, he saw a woman picking her way through the stubble, looking for stray grain that had fallen to the earth. The captain's heart was touched. He called to his steward, "Bring that woman in the field a jug of wine and a loaf of bread wrapped in fine linen." Then the captain went to the barns to check on a horse that had come up lame. Some time later the steward returned. He passed along the woman's thanks for his generosity and showed the captain the now empty wine jug. Inside the jug was the fine ring with which the captain had proposed to the widow. The captain ran into the fields in search of the widow. Eventually, many miles away, he found her picking through a field of corn that had not yet been harvested. The widow was alarmed at the sight of a prosperous gentleman, for she knew that she was breaking the law by stealing corn that was not hers to take. As he neared, she also recognized him as the captain and turned wearily away from him. She was both ashamed and afraid of being arrested. "May I give you back your ring?" he asked. "No, you may keep it," she said. "I am poor now, but now I am rich," said the captain. "I am no longer beautiful," returned the widow. "I believe that you are," said the captain. Soon they would marry. Needless to say, the widow now understood the value of things. Every Christmas afterwards, the captain and the widow would return to Stavoren in order to sponsor a feast for the people. Together they understood that this was right and good. They lived happily married ever after, and while the barren grasses on the sandbank continue to grow every year to this very day, the people of Stavoren are happy. They never waste a single grain and are thankful for every gift. And that, my friends, is the end. Well, I hope that you liked the story about the widow of Stavoren, and I thought, my friends, that I would give you 3 questions. I've told you before, the life and teachings of Jesus are important to me. When I tell a story, I like the story to sort of support the invitations that Jesus gives to us about how to live and how to pray and so on. And so I thought I would offer you 3 questions. Number 1, at the beginning of the story, does the widow need to learn to be generous? Now, generous is a big word. Some of you might not actually know that word too well, but it means to share. Does the widow at the beginning of the story need to learn how to share her wealth? And why? Why do you think so? And when I ask this question, I think of, in particular, the way that she took all that beautiful golden grain to help her people that the captain had bought, and to spite the captain, to sort of establish who was the boss, she was willing to throw that beautiful food into the ocean instead of giving it to her people. And so that was very sad to hear to read when the widow did that. And so it made me think that the widow needed to learn how to become generous, how to share her things. Her heart was a little hard, and she just could not accept the possibility of sharing her things, eh? It's very sad. Next question I have is, who is most humble at the beginning of the story? The wealthy widow or the sea captain? And why? And there's that word humble. What a virtue that is, to learn how to respect the people around you, and to just remember that everybody is equal or has something to say or has value. Everyone has value. And at the beginning of the story, I think of the wealthy widow taking that wedding ring and just laughing, and not really treating the captain with respect, speaking to him clearly, and how when the captain loses his ship and becomes an employee of hers, and he starts to work for her, how she continues to not really communicate to him as an equal or as a friend. So she's a little haughty. She needs to learn how to be humble. And because she isn't humble, she's a little bit blind to some of the beauty around her and to some of the gifts that she has, that she could be sharing. Remember the last question about being generous. It's very difficult for her to appreciate what she has and what she can do to connect with other people. And the last question I have is, does the widow learn to be thankful at the end of the story? Does she learn how to be thankful? And why? Now, when I think of this question, I think of how she lost everything. And she realized at the very end that what the captain had talked to her about was very important. And so she learned to appreciate the captain and his advice, which is why she kept the ring, which is maybe one way that she also learned how to be humble, or it's a sign that she learned how to be humble. And so at the end, the widow indeed realizes how beautiful a life she had. And I believe that because she lost everything, she learns how to become extremely thankful. So at the end, we even read about her and the captain bringing a feast to the people of Stavoren every Christmas. And it's a beautiful story because it shows how the wealthy widow grew up as a person to become a kind and caring and sharing and thoughtful person, and someone who we would want to have as a friend. So thank you, my friends, for listening today to this story. I appreciate very much your attention and your time with me, and I wish you peace. I wish you all the best. Okay, have a great weekend, my friends. Bye-bye.